Hi, this is Ant from Speakerstack Music. If you're subscribed to the channel, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, thanks for clicking on the video and please consider subscribing. So welcome back. We've been looking at EQing songs in Ableton. In the previous video that I did, we had a look at the EQ3, which is a very basic way of EQing. Gives you some ability to EQ, but a far more sophisticated, versatile way of EQing your track can be done in Ableton, and that's by using the EQ8 audio effect. So we're going to be having a look at that in today's video. So I've opened up the same song that I was working on in the previous video, and as you can see, we've got a number of different instrument tracks down this right hand side. Some of them are MIDI tracks, and we've also got a couple of audio tracks at the bottom there. So I'm going to go in and show you how you would use an EQ8 to EQ one of the instrument tracks. So we're going to go in and select a section of the music that we're going to mix using these arrows at the top here, which you can drag along, and I've picked the loudest part of the song, and that's the section that also has all the instruments in, and we're going to be having a look at the rhythm guitar and actually going in and EQing the rhythm guitar. And I've also clicked on this icon here, which means that we're looping that section of music round. If you click on that, it will loop between these two arrows. That's quite helpful because we want to obviously keep repeating that over as we EQ. The next thing, just to show you, is that I have added what's known as a spectrum audio effect to the master channel. We're going to be looking at this just to make sure that the EQ is doing the right thing, because we need to make sure that a lot of the energy and the volume and the high decibel levels are coming through at the bottom end of the frequency range. So the spectrum will help us do that. So let's go in and select the EQ8. You do that by clicking on this arrow here, then going to audio effects, and then going to EQ8, and you literally can click on that and drag that into the instrument channel that you're going to be working on, which is the rhythm guitar. And you can see I've dropped that in there, and you can see the audio effect there is showing in that instrument channel. One thing just quickly to point out is that there are some, if you click on the arrow here, there's some drop down menus and some presets that you can use as part of the EQ8 effect. So if you were producing a particular kind of instrument, you could go in and pick one of these presets. There's some for drums, some for general filters, some for vocals, and some instrument ones here if you were producing something like an acoustic guitar or strings or something like that. But we're going to be using the actual audio effect itself, not a preset, so I've just clicked on the main one and dragged that in. And then you have it appearing in the window at the bottom here, in the audio effects window, and we can go in and start to look at the different features that an EQ8 has. So you'll see here that there are a number of numbered points in the middle, and you'll see that there's some dials down the left hand side and some boxes down here with some symbols in. So we'll have a look at those each in turn. The other thing to mention on this is that you have this grid and background here. What that actually is doing is showing you the volume and decibel level for each area of the frequency range and the frequency range. And what the EQ8 allows you to do is go in and actually map out a far more versatile EQ range for the instrument that you're producing. So rather than just saying, oh, I want this to be this volume and in this decibel range, this frequency range, you can actually map out a certain pattern to the frequencies and the decibel levels across those frequencies. So you can really adjust it to get the exact sound that you're looking for. Because what you have with this is, and if I click on one of these points here, is the further up you drag these points, the higher the decibel or the volume level for that frequency range, or the lower the volume level or decibel level for that frequency range. And the more you drag it to the right and the left, the more you're working through those different frequency ranges. So if you drag this across to the right, you're going to go into the higher frequency ranges for the track, for the instrument. If you drag it to the left, you're going to go into some of the lower frequency ranges for the instrument. And these numbers along the bottom actually tell you what frequency the sound is at that particular point in this this image essentially. So what you have at the bottom is the lower frequency ranges, and what you have at the top is the higher frequency ranges, and then in the middle obviously the mid frequency ranges. And what you need to be doing when you EQ an instrument track is you need to be deciding where you want to position the instrument in those frequency ranges and then map it accordingly. So some instruments actually belong in the higher frequency ranges, and some instruments belong in the lower ones, and some belong in the middle ones. For example, if you were producing a drum kit, then things like the kick drum need to be in the lower frequency ranges around this bit. Things like the snare tend to be in the mid to upper frequency ranges, depending on how crisp and snappy you kind of want that snare. And things like hi-hats and cymbals would be in the upper frequency ranges up here. And that's just a drum kit. If you're moving on to things like guitars, they tend to be in the mid frequency ranges. If you're looking at bass, synthesizers, particularly sub basses and things like that, they need to be in these what we call the sub frequency ranges down here. And things like pads and mid synths need to be around here. And those kind of lead synthesizer sounds that you want, perhaps LFOs, things like that, again, you want those in the upper frequency ranges. What you've got essentially up here is a lot of that top end sound, that top end trebly sound, and what you've got down here is a lot of that bottom end bass sound. So it's very similar to the EQ3 in that respect, in that you've kind of got those three zones to think about. This is all your kind of space and air at the top end of the track sound, and this is all those kind of sub bass frequencies, those kind of booming kick drum and sub basses and bass synths that you have at that bottom bit that really kind of vibrate the speakers. So it's about understanding where you're positioning the instrument in that frequency range, and this is how you produce a track. So the EQ is absolutely integral to making sure that you get the mix and production right in a track. So you can go some way to mixing a track simply, if I flick to the mixer view, by panning the different instruments. So you might have some pan to the left or to the right in that stereo mix, and you can also think about the volume of the instrument track and again mix it that way. But a far more versatile way of shaping the sound and mixing it properly is by using EQ, because what this allows you to do is give each instrument space in the mix. If you define a particular position for that instrument in this frequency range and make sure that it has its own space, then it will feel like it isn't getting muddied up. It will be clearer, and it will be a just far more clearer mix that you're coming out with at the end. And EQ is what you need to use to do that. And it's really about understanding what volume level you want the instrument to be at in that particular frequency, and where you want it to sit in the frequency range. And you can use these parameters along the left hand side and along the bottom to shape the sound. The other thing just quickly to mention is you need to make sure that this button here is also clicked. This is the spectrum effect that you have on the master channel. So it has a very similar effect to the spectrum here, except that you're just applying it to that particular instrument track, not to the whole mix. So if you put a spectrum on the master channel, it's going to show you the entire song and where that's coming out in the frequency range. But if you have it on an individual channel, it will show you where that instrument is coming out in the frequency range. So let me just demonstrate the difference. So if I just click on this section of sound, I'm going to play you a section of the track really quickly so you can see the difference. So we've just played a section of the track, and I've just showed you how that's coming out on the spectrum. And what you can see there is you've almost got a bit of a kind of a mountain range effect going on in the background there. It's actually mapping out where the majority of the energy and the volume of the song is. And if we just play that again, you'll see that a lot of it is around this area here, which is exactly where it needs to be. The majority of the energy and the volume needs to be in those lower frequency ranges. Otherwise it's going to sound really top heavy. So I'll just play that again. So yeah, you can see that's going on there. Now if I show you the similar spectrum effect on the actual track channel itself, you'll see the difference there. So again, looking at that mountain range effect in the background there, you'll see that most of the energy here is happening between the 100 Hertz and the 10,000 Hertz range here. So just a word about these this measurement down here. So this is measured in Hertz or kilohertz, and that's essentially the different frequency range that you're working within. So we have here 100 Hertz, 1 kilohertz or 1,000 Hertz, and 10 kilohertz or 10,000 Hertz. Obviously 1,000 Hertz gives you a kilohertz. And so you can already see that the guitar is coming out as a very different, is coming out in a very different frequency range to the whole of the song, because the guitar naturally will kind of fit into those mid-range frequencies. It's not a bass instrument, it's not like a kick drum, but also it's not a high-end instrument like a lead synth or anything like that. So it naturally will kind of come out here. So that's why we always have that click, so we can map that. So going back to these ranges, you need to think really carefully about where you're going to position each instrument, and think about those kind of natural places where you would put instruments. So have a look online at those frequency ranges, but as a natural guide, as I said, I would essentially make sure that all your kind of sub basses and sub frequencies are down this end, your kick is around here, you know, you might have your snare around here, your bass needs to sit on top of your kick around here, your guitars have kind of come out in the mid frequency ranges, and then your high end instruments like parts of the drum kit like your hi-hats and your cymbals will be up here, and any kind of lead instruments like lead synths or lead guitars would sit in this kind of upper range here. And the idea, just to reiterate, is that you are positioning each instrument in the right part of the frequency range to give it space, so you're not muddying up the mix. And that's essentially what you need to do with the EQ. So you do that by deciding the decibel range or the volume range and where it needs to sit in the frequencies. So let's have a look at the different cymbals you can have. So you noticed here that essentially I dragged around this point here. You can actually, if you click on these squares here, you can actually add in up to 8 different points, which just gives you more versatility and flexibility. So you can actually use these in a far more dynamic way to really shape the frequency sound for that particular instrument. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to unclick those and just use 4. I tend to just use 4. 4 or 5, to be honest, is enough, unless you really want to fine tune the kind of the EQ on a particular instrument, in which case you might want to add more in. So that's those boxes down here. And obviously we use these points to drag these parameters around this to shape the sound. So you can really just think about how you want to shape it using these symbols. And I'll show you those in a second. The other thing just to mention is that rather than moving these with the cursor and clicking on them, you can also drag these dials here. So we've got one selected, and by moving this dial here, you can actually manually move it up and down the frequency range. That's what that dial does. You can increase the volume, the decibel level, by turning the gain dial or dragging the cursor down, and decreasing the gain volume, which is what this dial does. And then finally the Q dial, what that does is it tells Ableton how severe you want the EQing to be at that point in the song. So if you click on this, and then again we might just want to increase that up here, so this part of the frequency range is coming through as higher in volume. You can shape the Q using the Q. You can make that more gradual or less gradual and more severe, and that transition into that change, that's what we're talking about essentially. It's the transition into the change by turning the Q dial. So that's what those 3 parameters do. In terms of the symbols down below, you'll notice you've got a number of different symbols here. You've got these kind of claw-shaped symbols here, and then you've got these kind of circular shaped ones here. But if you click on this drop down, you've got a whole number of different ones you can click on, and they all do different things. So let's go through and have a quick look at those, and then I'll show you how you might want to apply it to a particular instrument. So point 1 is already set up with this symbol. This symbol is what's known as a low shelf or a high shelf EQ. And this is essentially a broad global shift to that part of the frequency range. So if you drag it up, you'll see that it takes everything from that point onwards, dropping down, and it raises the decibel level. So it's applying a global parameter to all frequencies underneath that point, that number 1 point. If we drag it up, you're raising the decibel level of that frequency range. If we drag it down, you're decreasing the decibel level of that frequency range. And you can do that in the lower frequencies, but you can also do it in an opposite way in the upper frequencies. So again, you know, you can use that to do the opposite. So in the higher frequency range, you might want to say, well, I want everything in the higher frequency range to be louder and more prominent. So you can drag it up and apply that as a global effect for all frequencies above wherever you have that point. So here it would be all frequencies above the 1000 hertz range, and we want louder. Or you could drag it down and say all frequencies from the 1000 hertz range I want quieter. Or you could move it up and you could say, well, let's apply it from 10,000 hertz or 10 kilohertz. So you can have that flexibility with the low shelf and the high shelf EQ. It's a global shift to give you a quick boost to the sound in all frequencies from that point onwards, either underneath or above those points, depending on where you position them. So that's the first one we've had a look at. The second one to have a look at is known as the bell EQ, and we've already got that set up for points 2 and 3, as you can see. And we did just do this a minute ago. What this does essentially is it allows you to boost the sound up or down in that frequency range, which is exactly what we just did. So if we click on 2 and drag it up, we're boosting the volume of all frequencies around. It's going to be around, if we put it there, you'll see that's between 100 and 1000. So it's coming out at about 500 hertz. We're boosting it up to about 12 decibels. Or we're dragging it down to minus 12 decibels around here, around the 500 hertz range. And that's really important for shaping the sound and wanting to boost it or cut out the energy and the decibel and the volume levels from that part of the frequency mix. And as I said, if you play around with the Q, you can essentially determine how narrow or wide that booster cut or enhancement is to that frequency range. So that's the bell EQ. The next one to look at is what's known as a high pass or a low cut filter. So if you click on this, and actually you have two options here, you can either have it as quite a severe cut times 4, or you can just have it as a more gradual cut. But what this does essentially is it cuts out all frequencies behind that point. So if we just apply the times 4 severe cut and then drag that up to 100 hertz, you'll see that from point 1 we are applying a high pass filter on all frequencies above 100 hertz, and we're cutting out all frequencies below 100 hertz. So you're cutting out all the sound that sits in that recording that sits below 100 hertz, you're cutting them out completely. So really useful for positioning the instrument in the right part of the mix. So that's what's known as a high pass or low cut filter. We're cutting out all the low frequencies, we're allowing all the high frequencies to pass through. Similarly, at the other end, you have the opposite. So if you click on 4 here and apply the same, again, you've got a times 4 option or a more gradual one. We'll go for the times 4 option. At the other end, you're applying the opposite. You're applying a low pass or a high cut filter or EQ to the to all frequencies. So what that means is you're allowing all lower frequencies to pass through, and you're cutting out all higher frequencies. So that's a low cut, high, sorry, let's get this right, a low pass, high cut filter, and that is a high pass, low cut filter. And what they're doing is they're cutting out everything beyond this bit here and this bit here. So let's just have a quick look at the guitar and I'll show you what that's done. So we've got a section of that looped, and I'm just going to blast it through and you'll see what it's doing to the sound. I'm going to turn it off and then I'm going to turn it on and you'll see the difference. Probably need to just solo it actually to give you the full effect on that. Let's just try that again. So you can hear the difference there. Applying this EQ in the way we have done has cut out all the high end and all the low end. We may not necessarily want all the high end cut out, and obviously you can go in now and adjust the sound a little bit, but it just it's showing us what the difference is and how you can use it. The other thing just to bear in mind is if we turn this off, we've got the spectrum applied here. We move these around, it just goes to starting to show you, looking at that mountain range in the background, what it's picking up and what it isn't picking up. So as I drag these in, you'll see that the frequencies that are being captured, i.e. that mountain range in the background, is being narrowed, and it's just going to start to sit between 100 Hertz and 10,000 Hertz. And actually you don't want a lot of these high-end frequencies anyway, because if I just drag this back, you'll see there's not a lot in this top bit. So there's nothing here, you're just capturing interference. And again down here, you're capturing all those sounds that the human ear can't hear, because what you have essentially going on here is a full frequency range. Anything really below 20-30 Hertz down at this end is inaudible to the human ear, and again anything above kind of this end here, 20,000 Hertz, 20,000 Hertz I think it is inaudible to the human ear. So there's no point in having it there. You're just going to be adding extra kind of background noise into the mix that most human ears aren't going to hear. So we probably want to cut out a lot of that, but we don't want to cut out too much of the high end. So I think if we just position it like that, we're probably going to find that's going to capture it quite nicely. So you can see it's already giving us a cleaner mix. If we unsolo the track and just blast it out, we'll probably just want to go in and just see how that has affected the position of the track in the overall mix, and we might just need to give a boost to some of these frequencies just to make sure it's cutting through a little bit. So you can see I've just boosted it. We're using the 0.3 here around the, what's that? It's going to probably be about 3 or 4 thousand Hertz range. Boosted the decibels just to allow that to cut through in the mix a little bit around that point. And that's how you essentially EQ a track, using those parameters that we've just talked through. The other thing to mention is some of the other symbols down here that we haven't talked about yet. The final one to mention is what's known as the notch EQ, and that's really helpful for taking out unwanted frequencies, and I'm going to cover that in the next video when I go into using an EQ sweep technique to remove any kind of unwanted nasty kind of sound from the frequency mix that you get sometimes from audio recordings, because you're picking up a lot of different sounds as you're recording, and some of those noises can be quite abrasive. So you would use the notch EQ, this one here, in order to do that. And I'll just quickly show you how you do that. I'm going to click on number 5, add another point in, and then I'm going to change that to a notch EQ. Bam, there you go. You can see what it's done. A notch EQ is already telling Ableton you want to cut out something from the sound. And again, you can go into the cue and just make that transition more gradual or sudden, depending on how you want to do it. If you're using the notch EQ as part of an EQ sweep to remove unwanted frequencies, you're probably going to want to have the cue set quite high, because you don't want to cut out all the sound. You just want to cut out a section, just take out something that's unwanted, without necessarily impacting all the other frequencies around it. So you probably want the that effect quite tight and narrow, so you want to drag that all the way up. But that's the notch EQ. So those are all the parameters that you can use when you're EQing, and I'm just going to take off number 5 because we don't need that. But when you're going through each of the tracks, you're going to end up with EQ8s that look kind of like this, but in different patterns. So, you know, if you're mixing drums and you're producing them, you're going to be EQing down at this end. So this pattern is going to be far more down here. If you're EQing high synths, they might be starting up here. So it's just a case of finding the position for that instrument in the mix and cutting out sections of it. One kind of principle and technique you'll want to take forward with all of this is, unless it's a sub bass, like a sub bass or a sub frequency, you're going to want to cut everything out that's below 100 hertz. So you shouldn't really be having any instruments other than the sub bass or a bass guitar or your kick that sit underneath this bit. So no other instruments other than your kick or your sub bass or your bass that sit underneath 100 hertz. So as a matter of course, I'd probably start off when you're EQing by adding this in and cutting all frequencies out on all instruments apart from those 3 instruments, cutting all the frequencies out using a high pass filter, low cut filter, starting at around 100 hertz, which is exactly what I've done with the guitar. The other principle I would consider as well, though, is just being gentle with the EQing. Doesn't take a lot to adjust the sound. So with the guitar here, you know, we've cut out the high end, cut out the low end, and we've just boosted ever so slightly around the 400 or 500 hertz range, just to give it that boost. And that's the kind of principle. Just take things gently when you're doing the EQing. Don't apply anything that's too dramatic. And the third and final thing to say is that obviously this has been about EQing the individual instrument channels. You can also use this effect to EQ the master channel, but I'll be covering that as part of a later video when we look into mastering techniques. This is purely about how you would apply the EQ to individual tracks. So there you go. That's how you would use an EQ8. It is far more versatile, flexible and sophisticated, but it's no more complicated, I don't feel, than using the EQ3, as long as you just get a feel for those different parameters and know how they work. So hopefully this video has given you an indication of how that works. EQing is an absolute mastery, so it's the kind of thing that you just need to get a feel for. Read up about where the different instruments need to sit in the mix. I will probably do a video covering that, a later video covering how to position different instruments, but it really is a case of getting a feel for it, and every mix is going to feel slightly different because you're going to have different instruments and you're going to want to have a different sound. But it really is that principle of using the EQ8 to create space around the instruments. And if there's a final rule that I would say around EQing, it's that not every instrument needs to be prominent and shining through in the mix. So, you know, this rhythm guitar, I would probably produce that alongside the lead guitar, which we've got here. And I would probably want to make sure that the rhythm guitar sat underneath the lead guitar, so that it didn't try and compete with it, because the lead guitar is the lead instrument. So it needs to be kind of sat slightly at the back of the mix. So you might want to go in, for example, with something like this and just adjust the decibel level. The other thing is to think about with this is, once you've EQ'd all the other instruments, if you've got a lot of other instruments sitting around these levels in the frequency range, again, you need to decide what's the position in the mix of all those instruments. You might want to push some of those sounds to the back, and that's just a simple case of lowering the decibels. So if you want to push the rhythm guitar to the back, lower the decibels on it. It's going to sit far further back in the mix there, and it just creates some space then for the other instruments in this decibel range, in this frequency range, sorry, just to sit and breathe and be kind of more forthright in the mix. So that's how you use the EQ8. I hope you found the video useful. If you have, please like it. It's just a quick click on the thumb symbol. Please subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more videos. I'm going to be looking at all of these audio effects in turn. As I said, the next video is going to be about doing an EQ sweep, and then the following videos are going to be about compressors and applying compression to tracks. So lots more to cover. So thanks again for listening. I hope you've subscribed and watched further videos, future videos. I hope you found the content useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next Speakerstack video.